So the difficulty we have with a lot of these hormones is that we have no way of measuring them. But for the vast majority of people, it's that sort of change in regulation of those hormones that we can't measure, that in combination with, 100 other things that have resulted in weight gain. And it's a dysregulation in one or more of those systems that can result in people living with obesity.
There's still this widespread view that weight is somehow calories in and calories out. It's very black and white. People kind of, label sugar and fat as bad, and yet they're craving more of these foods because of the food environment and because of the stress they're under. Then there's more worries about their weight. Then they get pulled back into more extreme, unhelpful, black and white dieting, and the cycle just continues.
I'm Guy Slater, Chief Medical Officer for Roxy+Rex. In a series of podcasts, I've been meeting with different medical experts to discuss obesity, its causes and its treatment. In our first episode, I was joined by Dr Eveleigh Nicholson, and today I'm joined by Dr Mel Rendall, a clinical psychologist with over 20 years' experience looking after patients who struggle with obesity. So maybe, Dr Rendall, you could introduce yourself to us, tell us a bit about yourself, your experience and so on.
Thanks, Guy. So my name's Mel Rendall, and I've worked in both NHS and private settings for the past 20 years, and I've always been passionate about supporting people with long-term health conditions and have a particular interest in obesity, weight management, bariatric surgery, particularly helping people, I guess, develop a much more flexible relationship with food, with their weight, their body image and how they see themselves.
Brilliant. So Eveleigh, for those of listening who didn't hear you in our first episode, what about you?
Yeah, so my name's Eveleigh. Like Mel, I work predominantly in the NHS as a medical consultant for diabetes and endocrinology, but I also have a specialist interest in helping people living with obesity and bariatrics. So from a medical point of view, that means looking after people both before and after weight loss surgery.
Brilliant. So today we're going to talk about obesity, what causes it, how we usually regulate weight, the food environment and so on. So Eveleigh, if we could start with you as an endocrinologist, presuming our bodies normally regulate weight very carefully, how do they do that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of hormones in our body that have an impact on our weight, lots of different hormonal systems, hormones being our chemical messengers. So we have hormones that help us feel hungry, so a hormone called ghrelin that comes from our stomach that makes us feel hungry. And then we have a whole series of hormones that come from our gut, from our fat tissue and from our pancreas that help us feel full and satisfied by our food. And then there's also other hormone systems that perhaps aren't directly about weight but can impact our weight. So our thyroid hormone, for example, our sex hormones, male or female, have an impact on our weight. So it's quite a complex combination of hormones that can all lead to changes in weight for people.
Okay, so I guess most days I eat roughly the same amount of food, the same amount of calories. If one day or maybe on a holiday I was to eat more, would the body fix that for me?
Yeah, so there's sort of three main systems in our body, if you like, that involve hormones that regulate our weight. So we've got one system that's mainly about hunger and satiety, so how hungry we feel and then how full we feel when we do eat. We've then got the slightly more, if you like, hedonic system that's about how satisfied we are with food, how much we enjoy it and the satisfaction we derive from it. And then we have that conscious control of eating, what we choose to eat and how much we choose to eat of it.
Okay. And then presumably with patients who struggle with obesity, something's gone wrong, something has changed their regulation of weight. Do we know what that is?
So the difficulty we have with a lot of these hormones is that we have no way of measuring them. So some of our hormones, like our thyroid hormone, our sex hormones, we can measure. And it's always important if someone, presents to us as a team, if they are struggling with their weight, that we rule out conditions, maybe underactive thyroid or things like that, to make sure there aren't things that are sort of indirectly causing overweight. But for the vast majority of people, it's that sort of change in regulation of those hormones that we can't measure, that in combination with 100 other things that have resulted in weight gain, and it's a dysregulation in one or more of those systems that can result in people living with obesity. But it's very difficult for us to measure that as we don't have the means to.
Okay. So Mel, in your practice, when you meet people who are struggling with their weight, can you see how these changes in their hormones affect their behaviour?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sadly, I think there's still this widespread view that weight is somehow calories in and calories out, and that not being able to control one's weight is really down to individual willpower. So many people come to me repeatedly and say, why am I struggling with these cravings all the time? Why am I struggling with portion sizes? Why am I struggling to feel full so soon after eating? And I think this is why what you're talking about, Eveleigh, is so important. I guess I think about these different hormones, ghrelin, leptin, insulin, as they're kind of like our internal communication system. So I try to speak to the people I work with. It's a bit like when these sort of hormones get disrupted, it's a bit like having a phone with poor reception. You know, these messages are getting in, but they're a bit scrambled or they're not very, very clear. So I think understanding this is key. You know, I notice that the more people have an understanding of this, the more they can start to be a little bit more compassionate towards some of the struggles that they have. And ultimately, you know, the message here really is this is not your fault. Your biology is likely working against you.
Yeah, no, that's key. So just looking at different people who struggle with their weight, we all know people who can eat like a horse and never gain weight, and other people who seemingly eat practically nothing and really struggle not to gain weight. I guess there must be genetic reasons for that. Eveleigh, you know, in your research, do you know much about that?
Yeah, so our genetics impact our weight in lots of different ways. You know, Mel said something really important there about, you know, obesity isn't a choice, it is not a lifestyle disease. We know already there are more genes that impact people's weight than controls our blood pressure, and we don't blame people and say it's a choice to have high blood pressure, and yet we still sometimes have this idea that people can control their weight just through, you know, what they eat alone, which is just not true. So when we think of our genetics and our weight, there's lots of ways our genes might impact that. So there's things like how full you feel. You know, some people can eat half a biscuit and feel full, and some people will have an entire packet and it not seem to make a difference. Our food choices. So, you know, if we had a buffet in here, the three of us would all pick up different food. We'd have different things on our plate. We'd have different amounts. And that is partly genetics as well. How our bodies respond to dieting. So, you know, if we all went on calorie restriction or did intermittent fasting, how much weight we would all lose and how our body responded, that would be different, because that's partly about our genetics. And where we store weight. You know, when we eat a sandwich, you can't say to your body, put it around my hips or put it around my tummy or put it around an organ. You know, again, that's all about genetics. And we always think of things like metabolism. We have this classic, men need 2,500 calories a day and women need 2,000, but all of our engines are different. Some people are Ferraris and they burn calories without, you know, thinking. And some of us are more like minis and very super efficient, but we tend to try and apply the same rules to everyone. So our genetics, which again, we can't measure, we don't have the tests for that for everybody, can affect how our weight fluctuates, even on a daily basis, in sort of numerous different ways.
And Mel, when we look at genetics and we look at behaviours, do genetics drive our behaviours?
It comes down to me, it's good to have an understanding of how genetics are influencing our biology. Obviously, understanding a little bit of how genetics, as Eveleigh was saying, impacts on appetite regulation and people's weight. It can powerfully validate some of the struggles that people have had with food and their relationship with food. It can hopefully start to reduce some of the shame that people have carried around with them after years and years of failed dieting. But I think it can also sometimes be discouraging for some people. I think people can kind of have this idea sometimes that genes are somehow our destiny and that we're powerless in the face to do anything about it. So I like to think that of genes as it's not necessarily about making things easier or harder. Genes don't determine the outcome. So I like your analogy, Eveleigh, of a car. So I guess if we think about our body as a car, gene set some of our car features, I guess. Like, it might determine the type of engine we have, it might determine how fuel efficient that car is, but actually our choices, our behaviours, our routines, our habits, how often we refuel that car, what we refuel it with, how often we maintain that car, that's the thing that ultimately determines outcome and performance. So I think key here is people letting go of the bits that perhaps, namely biology, the bits they can't control, and really start to focus on the aspects of performance, i.e. their appetite, their routines that are under their control, and ultimately, work best as they can with these medications.
So our genetics are a sort of two-edged sword, aren't they? They predispose us to obesity, but we have to make sure we're not ruled by them, and that we make change. I think you touched on maybe the psychological triggers that can cause weight gain and make it so difficult for patients. Maybe we could talk a bit more about that.
I think for all of us, probably, when we've sort of asked people to look back and think about their sort of weight loss trajectory, so many people will often talk about a period of significant weight gain during perhaps a host of difficult life events or trauma, whether it's divorce, sexual trauma, or bereavement. And we know, again, not everybody, but for a lot of people, they often talk about how either navigating that trauma or dealing with the aftermath, food becomes a very, very important way of managing the difficult thoughts and feelings that come up with that. And of course, the brain learns associations so quickly. So, what can happen is the difficult thoughts and feelings can come up. People then use food to get a temporary relief from how they're feeling, or give them a feeling, get rid of feelings perhaps that they don't want. Guilt and frustration can creep in. That triggers more cravings and more desire to eat to make ourselves feel better again. And that's where a vicious circle can come in. So I think particularly for people who are on these medications that perhaps are aware of the role that trauma's had in terms of how they manage their relationship with food or how they manage their emotions, it's really important to think about what other support might be useful alongside the surgery. We know that it's not impossible to still eat in quite a disordered way, even with these medications that could negatively impact on health or the outcome people have from medications. And I think it's also, if people do have the physical restriction that we hope they get from medications, if people don't have other ways of managing those difficult thoughts and feelings, that's when I notice sometimes that mental health can suffer.
Yeah. So it's important they seek help for that. So we've talked about past psychological events. It also seems to me that there's stages within our life that are key. Adolescence and puberty, pregnancy, menopause. How do these factors play into people's weight journey?
Yeah, so as Mel said, you get your sort of psychological major events, but we also have biological major events, as you said, stages of life. And that's when the hormonal environment shifts. And when you go through puberty, you get spikes in some hormones and dips in others. It's when you see people's shape changes and where body naturally lays fat down changes. When you go through menopause or menopause, and your sex hormones drop, that has an impact on where how your energy is used in your body, and again where fat lies. So all of those things matter. And then you have sort of those conditions like PCOS, for example, that are metabolic conditions that are a bit of that vicious cycle where, PCOS doesn't cause obesity, but obesity exacerbates PCOS, and these conditions of insulin resistance. And again, we come back to saying to people, just lose weight. Everything's better, like it's an easy thing to do. But then those biological systems sort of fight against that and just make it so hard for people to do.
Okay, so again, in people's weight journey, we know that there's other factors at play. People talk a lot about shift working, struggling with sleeping, stress. Presumably that plays on our hormones too?
Yeah, so we're sort of understanding more and more how the rhythm of our day, what we call circadian rhythms, when we sleep, how much we sleep, what time of day or night we sleep, all has a really big impact on our brain and the way our body both uses energy but also stores energy. We think about stress, and absolutely stress impacts psychologically, and I'm sure Mel will talk about that. Psychologically, it impacts how we feel about ourselves. And again, when you're tired, for example, your brain doesn't scream at you to get a ham salad, your brain screams at you to get quick energy. And so there are all kinds of ways that biology interacts with you psychologically as well to change your weight.
And Mel, that's from a psychological perspective as well.
Absolutely. None of these hormonal changes happen in a vacuum. So all these life transitions, whether it's things like menopause, pregnancy, puberty, at the same time, we're often facing different personal challenges, professional challenges, social challenges, and these in turn can affect our mood, our motivation, how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about bodies. And I think this is where biology and psychology can really collide. And I think particularly for people who have struggled with weight or their relationship with food, it kind of can create this perfect storm. People get easily pulled out of their rhythms around eating, perhaps getting into that pattern of skipping meals or snacking on the go rather than kind of having, putting that time into preparing food. People can start to use food again to manage the difficult thoughts and feelings and stress that are coming up during those life stages. So again, I think that understanding of brain and body together is absolutely key. It's trying to think, okay, be aware, what other support might people need? How can they find kinder ways other than food of treating themselves in self-care during these difficult times?
No, that's brilliant, Mel. Thank you. So I think together we've explored the genetic causes that predispose us to weight gain. We've looked at the psychological triggers. But if we were to go back 30 or 40 years, there just wouldn't be so many people struggling with obesity as there are now. So has something changed in our environment?
I mean, lots of things have changed in our environment, haven't they? How we work so much more nowadays is computerized or mechanized. People don't have to walk 2 miles to get to their place of work anymore, do they? We jump in cars, some of which frankly steer themselves. It's not like we even have to put our hands on the wheel barely. And then the type of work we do has changed. The type of food environment we live in, more and more of our food doesn't come from around us. It gets flown in. The type of food we eat, is it food that's come directly from the ground or directly from nature, or is it processed? And what processing means. And I'm not an expert in ultra processed foods, and I wouldn't want to dip my toe in that arena because there's plenty of experts out there, but we need to understand what we're putting into our bodies as well. It's not just about quantity, it's also about that quality of food and how that is probably changing our genetics as well, and the genetics of children. Kids don't have playing fields and they don't go out to play the way they used to. It's not necessarily safe to go out. It'd be great if, particularly as a female, you could go for a run in the dark, but the reality is possibly not. So there's just so many things that happen around us, again, that impact us as individuals and as a population that has shifted that weight upwards in the last few decades.
So it does seem to me that the thing that has really changed over the last 30 or 40 years is the food environment, and particularly ultra-processed foods. And again, manufacturers seem to be very smart. They have scientists that know how to direct their foods to the right reward centres, make it very difficult to avoid high sugar, high fat containing foods. And Mel, is that your sort of experience from a psychological perspective?
Absolutely. And it's particularly this pairing of the chronic stress that many people are under, coupled with the food environment we're in, that can really, again, create what I referred to earlier as this perfect storm. As chronic stress drags on, our body goes into some sort of survival mode. We're often, our focus drops, our motivation drops, our mood can drop. We can get pulled out of our sort of regular eating patterns. We can start to crave much more high sugar, high energy foods. Time gets squeezed, and over time, we know this stuff is engineered to make people want to eat more of this stuff. And over time, this, again, it's another vicious cycle that people get pulled into very, very easily.
Yeah. And I guess with all this stress and reaching out for rewards, blood sugar goes up and down, and that becomes difficult to regulate.
Yeah, so again, this is how these medications came about, was looking at diabetes, but we know swings in blood sugars, people feel unwell with them, And they then drive food-seeking behaviour as well. If your blood sugar's low, your body goes into survival mode, and you've talked a bit about that, but it screams for you to eat things. And when your blood sugars go high, people feel sluggish and they feel lethargic, and that increases stress. And yeah, as you said, it's that perfect storm of fluctuations that people get stuck in.
And I think what this also touches on for me is, I suppose, for want of a better word, the damage that years of dieting can do to people's relationship with food, isn't it? It's very black and white. Food is either good or bad. So again, we're coming back to that vicious cycle. People kind of, label sugar and fat as bad, and yet they're craving more of these foods because of the food environment and because of the stress they're under. This leads to them feeling more guilt, more frustration, and that often then guilt, as we said, with triggers more cravings to want to eat more. Then there's more worries about their weight. Then they get pulled back into more extreme, unhelpful, black and white dieting, and the cycle just continues.
Great. So we've talked about, the causes of obesity. Now we need to find the answer to it. But, for years, it's been diet and exercise, but it doesn't seem to have worked. Do we know why that should be?
So when you diet, essentially most diets are calorie restriction. They're physically eat less, but that puts bodies into starvation mode. When humans evolved, you'd kill your woolly mammoth, you'd drag it into your cave, you'd eat as much of it as you could, and then you might not be able to eat for days or weeks or months. So humans sort of evolved from a time of feast and famine. You would feast, but then humans survived by their bodies being able to slow down their metabolism, to shut things down, to survive the famine before your next feast. And we sort of said we no longer, in the Western world, we don't live with famine. We have feast all the time. So our bodies are designed to store things up, thinking a famine might come, and it never comes. So when we do diet, our bodies are shocked and they go into famine mode, and our metabolism slows right down. So you need fewer calories. Your body burns fewer calories. It goes from being a Ferrari to being a Mini. But on top of that, your hormones adapt, and your hormones adapt to try and get your weight back up again. It doesn't matter. The body doesn't recognize that perhaps the start weight was unhealthy to begin with. So your hunger hormones go up. So you feel hungry all the time. And anyone that's been on a diet will know that sort of food seeking goes into overdrive. That food noise is very difficult to live with, which is different to hunger as well. And our studies show us that even after someone stops a diet, those hormones that drive hunger remain high. So it's counterintuitive, but your body really fights to get your weight back up again. So, some people undoubtedly do very well with dieting, and most people we see achieve weight loss with diet. But the difficulty is then keeping that weight off, because then what happens is all those other hormones, all those other things change to fight to bring weight back up. And I've seen plenty of people over the years that have lost really impressive amounts of weight through dieting, and then regained it all, and often with a little bit extra. And that's really just the body's systems all kicking in to get them back where they were. So dieting it's not a way to lose weight and keep that weight off long term. And exercise is very important. It's important for your bone strength and your muscle strength and your mental health. But again, studies tell us that it's not terribly good for weight loss, because we massively overestimate how many calories we burn when we exercise, but also exercise stimulates your appetite. So, you can exercise a fair bit, but actually the number of hours of running you might need to do to lose a kilogram is, a ridiculous amount that most of us couldn't achieve in our working lives. And you get hungry afterwards. So again, then there is a place for, thinking about what you eat and how much of it you eat. And there's absolutely a place for exercise. But in terms of sustainable weight loss, most people will struggle with that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I guess, it's not a surprise that we've evolved to survive famine. And all we're seeing when we diet is our body's treating it as a famine, making us overwhelmingly hungry, making it really difficult. And I think it's beyond anyone to fight their willpower indefinitely.
But this is why these conversations are so important, isn't it? The amount of education that's still needed, the amount of people I talk to that still tell me today that they stop exercising because they're not seeing the results, they're not seeing the weight loss. And there's so much education to help people understand that, yeah, this is where exercise is rubbish for weight loss, but it's really effective for weight maintenance, really effective for our mental health. It's one of the biggest factors that we know will help people's outcome in the long term. And I guess there's the direct physiological impact of exercise, but there's also the reality, isn't it? If we're active, we're more likely to be doing the things in life that matter to us. If we're doing the things in life that matter to us, we're much more likely to be able to look after ourselves a bit better nutritionally, or how we treat ourselves when we're under chronic stress, or how we treat ourselves when we're facing with different life stages.
And from a health perspective, the exercise is the single biggest thing we can do to make ourselves healthier.
And and as I say, I think the difficult with exercise is people tend to think of it as being gyms and Lycra, and actually exercise is anything that makes you a little bit out of breath and a little bit sweaty. So for a lot of people, that might just be as simple as going to a corner shop to buy the newspaper or the milk. It doesn't have to involve equipment. It doesn't have to involve subscription fees. And I think, again, the idea of exercise also puts people off doing some really simple things. You will always hear again of people losing weight, and again through exercise, and that again is because everyone's genetics are different, and I wouldn't want to put people off exercising, but again it's just not great for that significant sustainable weight loss.
And we know that gyms are barriers for so many people. Imagine the amount of people that tell us how intimidating it is. You know, we're looking at a lot of people who have struggled with body image or body shame, judgments of other people. So going into those sorts of environments can be so intimidating. And I think sometimes we just come up against the tricky brains we carry around. You know, we have brains that think big and think it has to look this way, or has to be, you know, we have to do our 150 minutes in a gym. And actually this is often about just creating these tiny little habits, just small steps. As Eveleigh said, maybe just look initially for just opportunities to just start injecting a little bit more movement into our days.
Brilliant. It's been great to talk to you both today, and I think we've got a much better understanding of the issues that drive obesity and why it's so difficult to lose weight. From my perspective, I guess my take home when I think about people is that maybe with the knowledge that it's not easy to lose weight, that there's maybe genetics behind it, perhaps they might be a bit kinder to themselves, and maybe other people may be kinder towards them too. And for you two, do you have take-home messages as well?
Yeah, so I think my take-home message is that, yeah, living with obesity is complex, and understanding that education piece, understanding the biology and all the different factors that results in the weight people are living with, you know, not to be discouraged because what works for me might not work for you and might not work for Mel, or vice versa. And understanding all those things, and understanding that small changes in lots of different areas, you know, quality and quantity of food, adding in the exercise, addressing the mental health. You kind of need to make changes in lots of those different areas, and it's unlikely for most people that just one thing will make the change overall.
Absolutely agree with that. I think there's no denying that these GLP-1 medications powerfully change biology, you know, impacting, allowing people to get a better sense of hunger and fullness. And it's creates, I think, this breathing space for people, this space for people to step back and realize, gosh, maybe this hasn't been my fault after all. And, you know, within that breathing space, it's sort of that ability to let go of some of this fight that they've had towards their bodies, their weight, food for, you know, often many, many, many years. But I think what's important for me is that whilst I think these medication changes can nudge people towards different behaviours, they don't necessarily completely change our habits. You know, they're not going to rewrite perhaps the complex relationship that we've had with food through childhood, or different traumas we may have gone through in our lives, or different stresses that we've had. So it's about thinking about what other support do we need, you know, to pair. This is where psychology can come in sometimes. So my take-home message is for people that do decide to go on these medications, just be aware, notice what changes about your habits, but also notice what changes don't happen. And are there other things out there, whether it's around getting some life coaching or psychology or some exercise support, really, just to help you supercharge your outcome, get you into much better eating habits, find healthier ways of managing stress, and ultimately just getting a much more flexible relationship with your body, your weight, your shape, and food.
Brilliant. Thank you again to both of you. In our next episode, I'm going to be joined by Shaw Summers to discuss both the surgical and medical management of obesity. And then after that, the four of us are going to meet, myself, Dr. Nicholson, Dr. Rendall, and Mr. Summers, for a round table discussion that should be varied and interesting.